The Chosen Season 4 Episode 6 is a really special one. The majority of the episode follows the disciples as they celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days, setting the stage for Jesus' well-known "I am the Good Shepherd" teachings, John 10, on the last day. But because of a rare beginning flash forward that foreshadows the horrific conclusion that events are heading towards, there is a sense of dread and impending doom hanging over all of these occurrences. 6th episode has a bottle-like quality to it. There are only seldom breaks to the secondary plot, and most of the time is devoted to one plotline with a number of character-driven subplots. The 6th episode opens with a flash forward. With Big James badly hurt, the followers, drenched in dishveld, stormed into a quiet inn dining room. Simon Z silences them as they wonder what all of the recent happenings imply. They see someone coming in worried that it might be a pursuer. The episode then fast-forwards a few days to the start of Hanukkah, the Jewish holiday dedicated to rededication. Following the prayer and lighting of the first candle, the disciples role-play the events that the celebration honors: the ascent to power of Alexander the Great, also known as Alexander the Worst by the Jewish disciples, his untimely death, the division of his empire into 4 kingdoms led by his generals, and King Antiochus Epiphanes' Sabbath day attack on Jerusalem, which resulted in the desecration of the temple with the blood of pigs and the abomination of desolation, Sif. Daniel 9:24-27. Following this initial round of acts, a few of the disciples trade gifts. Matthew and John, for example, give writing equipment to one another. Thomas is constantly shown to us in this scene and the ones that follow, haunted by the memory of Rama. The next evening, the festival resumes, with the disciples acting out the following events: the persecution of the Jews by Antiochus Epiphanes, the uprising spearheaded by Judah Maccabee, the Greek expulsion from the temple along with the idol of Zeus, and the rededication of the altar, wherein the lamp, miraculously, continued to burn for 8 days despite only having a day's supply of oil. During the 3rd night of the celebration, the disciples sing and recite passages from Psalms 116, 113, and 118 in praise of God. Following an arm wrestling bout in which Andrew triumphs over John, Jesus tells the company that he will be traveling to Jerusalem on the last day of the celebration to give a teaching session in the temple. Thomas thinks that Jesus is ready, pointing out that the last time he taught in public, shortly before Rama died, was not great. When the other disciples are enjoying their gifts the following morning, John wonders what he may offer Thomas, and they finally settle on getting him new sandals. Matthew takes a look at the bag to make sure there is enough cash. Startled by how little he discovers, he chooses to ask Judas whether there is another pocketbook. Judas is not amused by Matthew's plea. He maintains that they will have to barter their way up because they don't have enough money. Even after the recent expenses, Matthew is perplexed because he has mentally calculated everything and is certain they should have enough money. Judas bemoans the group's slow and ineffective progress while maintaining that Matthew is mistaken. They have more to do for the country. Matthew proceeds to inform the others that they would have to barter because he doesn't want to cause any trouble. At the market, Peter diverts Thomas by asking for his assistance in choosing soap, while Andrew, James, and John try to barter up to a new pair of sandals. When he inquires about Thomas's emotional state, Thomas replies that although he ought to feel appreciative, he truly feels awful. When he is working on a task, that is the only moment he doesn't feel terrible. Following Peter's disclosure of Eden's miscarriage, Thomas discovers that he previously knew about it from Rama and connected it to Peter's meeting with Jesus on the lake. Thomas wonders why Jesus has aided others but not Rama, just as Peter once did. As long as Thomas is prepared to accept the responses that God gives, Peter affirms Thomas's right to ask questions about God. But arguments based on free will or the idea that God's ways are superior to our own are unconvincing to Thomas. The disciples sing a rendition of Psalm 115 on the 4th night as they give thanks to God. While Thomas accepts his new sandals, Matthew casts a dubious glance towards Judas. From Bethany, on the other side of the Jordan, comes a message. While explaining that Lazarus is ill, Jesus reassures them that this illness does not cause death. Feeling miserable, he heads out for the night. The Song of Miriam, Exodus 15, is encouraged to be sung by the women in the interim. Another night goes by. The disciples are winnowing and threshing wheat the following day. Disturbed by this menial work, Judas suggests that they choose donation collectors in the communities they visit, who would then gather money each time they pass by. None of the other disciples appear really thrilled about Judas' suggestion. Instead, they all appear pleased to thresh wheat. Angered, Judas heads to his own meal, but John spots him and approaches to have a conversation. John questions whether Judas, like he and James did, is conflating his personal desire with the growth of the kingdom. John tells Judas to talk to Jesus about it after he argues that he's just being creative and attempting to ease the tension brought on by ambiguity. When Judas encounters Jesus in a field watching a sheepfold, he adamantly states that all he wants is for Jesus' kingdom to come and for all barriers to be lifted out of the way. Following his explanation of his donation plan, Jesus tells Judas that he has a vision that exceeds his wildest expectations and begs him to closely monitor the emotions his impending speech arouses in him. Judas walks away irritated. During the feast's seventh night, the disciples offer Psalm 118 in prayer. The disciples are anxious about their impending trip to Jerusalem. They eventually reach the temple in Jerusalem after crossing the Jordan the following day, Judas paying the ferryman. Some religious authorities observe as Jesus starts to deliver his well-known Good Shepherd lectures, John 10, as he passes by some sheep that are being kept for slaughter. Though they don't recognize him right away, they quickly become upset by the suggestion that he is bringing Gentiles into God's fold. Judas is unable to concentrate because of the mockery directed at Jesus. On the other hand, the religious authorities are starting to see that Jesus is presenting himself as God's special son. When Jesus ultimately decides it's time to go, the religious authorities intervene and demand to know if he truly believes he is the Messiah. Jesus goes one step farther and says that he and the Father are one, insisting that his action bears witness to his identity. The religious authorities are pushed over the edge by this, and they start throwing stones at the disciples for what they perceive to be blasphemy. Judas watches, angry that Jesus doesn't defend himself, as the disciples are forced to run when John is struck. They leave Jerusalem as darkness falls and cross the river without waiting for a ferryman. We pick up at the beginning of the episode as they head back to the inn. James hurt on the table, the disciples drenched and afraid, Simon Z nervously observing from the window. Zebedee, who is stunned by his son's injury, is their guest. While reading a letter, Jesus delivers it to Mary Magdalene, who informs the group that Lazarus has passed away. The disciples are shocked by this news because they remember Jesus saying the illness wouldn't result in death. When Jesus says Lazarus is just sleeping and needs to be woken, they become even more perplexed. It doesn't help much when Jesus tells them that Lazarus died so that they could believe, especially Judas, who doesn't get it. Even though it means dying with Lazarus, Thomas, who is a little bit fey, is cool with the thought of traveling to Judea to be with him. Since Mary has been paying attention to what Jesus has been saying, she is the only one who can sense his anguish and pain. Zebedee tells the terrible news about the conspiracy to have Jesus crucified, which exacerbates the situation. The narrative of the disciples is interrupted at some point in the episode to focus on Yusuf's writing. Yusuf begs his father not to give up on him in the event that things with the Sanhedrin go wrong when his father finds him. Even when he was annoyed that Yusuf didn't choose the easy route and instead served in a remote area, his father reassures Yusuf that he has never doubted him. Soon after Jairus receives Yusuf's letter, he locates Zebedee and learns about the scheme to have Jesus crucified in order to further their own goals. Zebedee offers to go warn the disciples himself because Jairus feels it would be too dangerous to send word to them personally because of the order. Under false pretenses, he encloses a letter of approval from Jairus with a supply of oil for the Jerusalem temple. When he gets there, he's concerned about the attempted stoning, but also a little happy to learn that it was an unplanned incident. He informs the disciples that a severe deterioration is imminent. I thought episode 6 was really interesting and like a lot of things about it. I have pointed out that the third episode of seasons 1 to 3 is a bottle episode. Season 4 seems to have killed the tradition, which shocked and disappointed me a little. I'm now wondering though if it has continued at all, if in a different capacity. Episode 6 is very almost a bottle episode, as I mentioned earlier. Here's a theory. For the first 3 episodes of the first half of the show, there were no bottle episodes. Now that we've reached the halfway mark, things will change, and bottle episodes will appear in the 6th episode of every season. That is, the 3rd episode from the final. This is a really creative and biblical use of chiastic structure. If my understanding is correct, when TV shows or films start with a flash forward to the most thrilling scene, I'm usually not a big fan. It may seem like a cheap trick to get people excited. Nevertheless, I believe it was the perfect decision in this particular episode since it reinterpreted the lighting of the 8 candles as a sort of countdown to disaster, adding a foreboding element to the otherwise happy events. I generally enjoy it when The Chosen incorporates Jewish holidays into its lessons on biblical history. Since the Book of Maccabees is not part of the Protestant canon, Protestants seem to be less aware of its origins, which makes it especially worthwhile around Hanukkah. The program performed an excellent job of entertaining the audience despite the intricate history of Hanukkah, thanks to the funny acting of the disciples. In my opinion, there is a very intriguing relationship between human agency and free will, as well as fate and God's will. I'll go into further detail in my analysis. That Thomas's sorrow hasn't been forgotten makes me happy. An ideal time to reevaluate his grieving process is on holiday. It's a nice thing for the show to remind us of how much the disciples enjoy spending time together after all of the strife in recent episodes. Throughout the entire experience, there was a strong sense of unity among the disciples. A wonderful method to illustrate this was to have them all perform music together. Perhaps because I can identify to Judas' struggles as a creative person who occasionally feels out of place in the religious community, I truly like Judas' struggles in this episode. By the end of the program, I was actually rooting for him. The flight over the Jordan and the attempted stoning happened quickly and furiously. Usually, Jonathan Rumi is very nice and kind. When he ridiculed the Pharisees and laughed at how little they understood the law of Moses, I was shocked. It's a side of Jesus' gospel portrayal that hasn't been fully revealed until this season, but Rumi does an as good job of capturing it as he does Jesus' softer moments. Thomas said it perfectly when he said, "I will die with Lazarus. I was slain by it, but I did run into a few problems." I believe that the choice to display all 3 episodes in a single theatrical presentation hurt episode 6 more than episode 5. It's difficult to watch so many episodes at once, as I mentioned in my assessment of episode 5. Compared to episode 5, episode 6 had a lot more intensity, but I had to pay much closer attention to it. Once again, I believe that a bit stricter editing would have benefited the show. The presentation could have had a better pace by trimming a minute or 2 here and there, even though I enjoyed the music and fellowship. The plot of obtaining Thomas' sandals seemed like it might have been simplified, but not completely removed. The way this story addressed Judas was crucial. Specifically, it seemed as though Peter and Thomas were simply restating what Peter had already learned from his loss in a discourse that didn't really add anything new. I'm not convinced if the non-bottle plot was truly necessary. Could Zebedee have just revealed that he had heard of a scheme when he unexpectedly appeared at the end? This plot seemed like a dull diversion because it consisted primarily of characters reiterating facts that we already knew to one another. James shouldn't ignore the injury, I hope. He seemed to bounce back a little too rapidly. In the future, I will be dissatisfied if the suffering he endured had no genuine, long-lasting effects. A minor continuity question. Thomas claims that Jesus hasn't given a public lecture since Ramah's death, but in episode 3, during the montage, isn't he seen giving a pretty public teaching? A number of themes emerged in episode 6. Because the 2 episodes overlap, I discuss a few in my analysis of episode 5. However, 2 at least are exclusive to episode 6. Understanding and ignoring others. In episode 6, relationships are the main focus. Hanukkah, a lengthy festival, is an ideal setting for this relationship-focused content since, as viewers, we connect holidays with family, friends, and other comforts. Instead of achieving their ministry goals, the disciples are primarily shown in this episode rejoicing and having fun as a community. Through a number of tangible examples, including the disciples' compassionate care for Thomas, their thoughtful gifts to one another, and their respect of one another's special abilities and expertise, the tale demonstrates to us how well the disciples know one another. In this sense, John is unique. He makes a thoughtful gift choice for Matthew and appears to be well aware of Thomas's loss, assisting in the arrangement of a thoughtful gift for him. He understands Judas' frustration as well and uses appropriate language based on his experience. Providing Thomas with a space to be acknowledged and valued is another major goal of Peter and Thomas's talk. However, the disciples also exhibit important and noteworthy instances of relational blindness. When Matthew begins to suspect that Judas is hiding something, he turns to falsehoods and fury to keep his true identity hidden. Judas later leaves on his own after his suggestion to establish collecting points is rejected. It is obvious that he feels misinterpreted and alienated by everyone, including Jesus. John advises Judas to question Jesus about his beliefs in order to have a closer relationship with him, rather than trying to figure out his ideas on his own. Judas is too preoccupied with his own worries and ideas to listen to Jesus when he asks him to pay attention to what he is saying, which is to get to know him. Not just Judas feels that he isn't given enough credit. Because of the distance between him and the disciples, Jesus is seen to struggle throughout the episode. When word of Lazarus' illness spreads, this conflict erupts, and Jesus is forced to keep his sorrow a secret from the disciples until they learn of Lazarus' passing. Because Mary Magdalene has been following and getting to know Jesus while the other disciples have been largely ignorant, Mary Magdalene is the sole disciple who even now feels an internal agony for Jesus. It is noteworthy that Jesus is not immediately recognized by the Pharisees and other religious authorities who confront the disciples in the temple. When he says that he and the Father are one, he discloses his true identity, yet even then, they still don't fully get who he is. The religious authorities believe that Jesus should be stoned as a result, but Jesus corrects them by saying that they are ignorant of the law of Moses, which, remember, is him, according to the chosen. Jesus, on the other hand, claims to be the good shepherd who recognizes and is recognized by his own. He demonstrates his excellent relational understanding of his flock when he recognizes the difficulty that is behind Judas' inquiries and suggestions and directs him towards a possible solution. Yosef understands that when Jesus said that we shall receive what we ask for, he was implying that God will not withhold relationship knowledge or himself from people who sincerely seek him. As he declares that he and the Father are one, Jesus' desire to know us and be known by us is a reflection of his complete knowledge and relationship with the Father. It also emphasizes the value of having personal expertise as a security and safety measure. Judas suggests that letters of recommendation could be a way to get around the requirement of trusting individuals that the disciples haven't had time to get to know, which could be a problem with his idea to establish contribution centers. Zebedee demands that they deliver the news of the conspiracy against Jesus to Jairus because they cannot trust Zebedee to carry it. Zebedee alone must bear it. Simon Z becomes agitated as he sees someone approaching the house the disciples are in until he realizes who it is. We can see that personal knowledge fosters a sense of safety and trust in all these ways, and maybe a few more that I've missed, and that a lack of it fosters mistrust and anxiety. The mysteries of God's will, human agency, and divine prescience. It is impossible to read the Gospels, especially the Gospel of John, without considering the interplay between divine knowledge, divine will, and human free will. Although it isn't a central theme in episode 6, it is implied by the way the show is structured and by some of the questions the characters pose. The episode's opening flash-forward gives viewers the impression that the events they are about to witness are heading towards a planned, unavoidable conclusion. Nevertheless, how those events really play out isn't controlled or mechanized. We witness the decisions taken by different personalities and how some may have made different decisions. There's a sense of autonomy and choice as well as fate. This dynamic is especially noteworthy in relation to Judas. Several times in the Gospel of John, it is implied that Judas knew he would betray others. Many readers have questioned if this implies that Judas lacked agency or free will. The most comprehensive description of Judas' personality and motivations, however, is found in the same Gospel. As I observed Judas' encounters with Jesus throughout the program, I couldn't help but think of the Gospel of John. Jesus appears to be aware of Judas' actions and even makes an effort to warn him by his teachings. However, viewers are aware of how the story ends. Judas' disregard for Jesus' teachings almost seems inevitable. Therefore, did God's will or Judas' free will lead to his downfall? These kinds of distinctions can be difficult to make at times. Analogously, Jesus' Good Shepherd poses comparable queries about the interplay between free will and divine intention. Jesus makes a point of saying that his sheep recognize him and will listen to his voice. Therefore, is it God's will or human decision that causes one to react to the shepherd's voice? The show's portrayal of Jesus' teachings does not include as many further explanations as it usually does. It is up to us to analyze the tension. As the disciples continue to process Ramah's death and Eden's miscarriage, they also discuss God's will and human agency. Peter gives Thomas two things to consider as he looks for explanations. God has a will that is greater than our capacity for comprehension, and humans possess free will. A great deal of dispute exists over the definition and relationship between the divine will and the human will, despite the fact that the majority of historical Christian traditions declare that both are important in constructing our reality. Because The Chosen is an ecumenical effort, it wisely stays out of this discussion and only states that both are important. This is one of the reasons it's hard for us to make sense of the chaotic events that occur in our world. I have a suspicion that the program wants Jesus' internal struggle. He embodies both heavenly will and human agency, to be practically symbolic of the enigmatic conflict between these two truths. To be quite honest though, I'm not sure what precisely we're supposed to learn from that. Maybe I should think about these topics further and meditate on them before continuing the presentation. Do you have any more themes you'd like to mention, or would want to comment on my analysis or review? Post your ideas in the comments section below.